Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing presidential assassination attempts, past, present, and future, with Director of the Center for Presidential History and Professor of History at Southern Methodist University, Dr. Jeffrey Engel. Understand the history behind those plots to kill the most powerful person on the planet and what ramifications these events have on American society, both now and in the future. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Professor Jeffrey Engel. He is an expert on presidential history and a scholar of our American political system. One of the most impactful events that can occur in politics is an assassination attempt on the president. Whether successful or not, the ripple effects of these plots can have significant and long-term consequences on our country. Over time, there have unfortunately been several presidential assassination attempts, each with different aftermaths. Questions remain. Why do they occur? What are the common characteristics? How do we react as a nation? Can we learn from them and move on? And most importantly, what does our future look like? I loved this interview since Professor Engel's perspective is so comprehensive. His incredible knowledge base allowed for an inspiring discourse that expanded my vantage point. Politics are volatile by nature, and presidential assassination attempts only add fuel to the fire. Listen up as we discuss presidential assassination attempts, past, present, and future. Check it out. Hey, Jeffrey, how you doing?
Hey, it's good to see you again.
Listen, great to have you back on the podcast and talking about the history of presidential assassination attempts, obviously a critical topic based on what happened in the last several weeks. And it's great to have your expert opinion.
I'm looking forward to chatting. I really am.
Give us, our listeners, a little bit of background and perspective. Over the history of this country, how many presidential assassination attempts have we had?
Around a dozen that are, legitimate, if you will. And there's a wide range on how you can determine legitimate. It's important to know that the president today gets, several thousand threats every year from people. And so where you draw the line between a threat and an actual attack, and knowing that an attack was thwarted, does that count as an attack, et cetera, et cetera. But I think 12 times where we would say the public went, oh my goodness, that just happened. And those range, of course, from the ones that everybody knows about, including Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, those stories, to ones that are more obscure. William McKinley. I don't know that any of my students know that William McKinley existed, first of all, but second of all, that he was shot and shot in Buffalo, which I always remind people is redundant. There's a real sense in which Reagan's assassination, because it happened so early in his campaign, in his presidency, it happened just a few months into his presidency. We remember all the other things that Reagan did, and it's almost an afterthought, a footnote, if you will, to his presidency. So they really run the gamut between ones that changed the entire nature and course of American history to even successful assassination attempts, success in quotations, in which we find that history, doesn't move the needle all that much.
Now, there's been, like you said, 12 or so of these attempts. Looking back, is there a common thread, a national crisis to each of these events? For example, war or depression?
I really think the important thing for people to take away from looking at the entire set as an aggregate are two things. First, no scientist, you're a scientist, no scientist would do a sample size of just 12 and try to draw any conclusions. And by the way, that's true for presidents too. We've only had 45. By the same token, I think what I take from looking at the 12 is that there is no pattern. We have some instances, John Wilkes Booth, for example, where we not only know specifically that they acted for a particular political reason and killed the president to prevent them from going forward with policies, we know the date and time that he learned about the policy. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln soon after Lincoln had just announced for the first time publicly that he was going to be in favor not just of African Americans having citizenship, but of African Americans having the right to vote. And that for Wilkes Booth was just a step too far. And so we have a very clear example there of an ideological motive. We have other examples. Again, go back to McKinley, where he essentially was shot by an anarchist, someone who was simply troubled and disruptive for the entire system, didn't have a particular agenda so much as felt that the society needed broad change. By the way, by shooting McKinley and bringing in Theodore Roosevelt, one of the great progressive presidents, reforming presidents, if you will, he winds up actually getting a lot of the change that he probably would have wanted. Then we have cases like Lee Harvey Oswald. I'll be honest with you, I live here in Dallas, and I spend a lot of time, near Dealey Plaza. In fact, I still don't have a good grasp of why Lee Harvey Oswald did what he did. We presume it had something to do with politics because he was a very politically motivated person, but we don't exactly know specifically why he chose to do what he did. And then just jump all the way to Ronald Reagan. His would-be assassin in 1981 shot him. It was a really sad story. Shot Reagan because he was having mental problems, and he thought that it would impress a girl. In fact, the girl in question was the actress Jodie Foster. He had worked in his mind somehow that if he shot Reagan, Jodie Foster would like him. So we really run the gamut. It was my
That's
point.
crazy.
From those that are genuinely politically motivated to those that are just simply, let's call them unfortunate.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point you bring up, and I doubt that many of our listeners understand that. You would think that these assassination attempts are 100% politically motivated. Like, this guy wants to kill Donald Trump because he hates, what he stands for. But it may not be so simple, is what you're saying. There might be underlying motivating forces that are not politically based.
Well, and I think especially if we think about the recent assassination attempt against former President Trump, and I don't want to get ahead of my skis here. We're still only a couple weeks after the event, so information is trickling out through the news media. But a picture that seems to be appearing resembles more of a school shooter, if you will, than a political assassin. That this was a very troubled young man who was angry and had access to firearms, and that's not a great combination. In fact, I hypothesize, based upon the caricature that's coming out, that he didn't necessarily have any political agenda against Trump. And if President Biden had been coming through his town, he would have shot at President Biden. That he wanted to take out his anger at something that was so big, someone that was so important, that his name would go down in the history books and that he could actually feel like he made a difference in his life. It's just a very unfortunate case, to be sure.
The other thing that we've seen with these attempts is that they tend to precipitate a bunch of conspiracy theories. So, for example, the moment Trump got shot at, people were saying, "Oh, that was just the glass breaking on his earpiece, that the bullet actually didn't hit him. The bullet was nowhere near him, and it's all a plot and a scam." How often do these conspiracy theories circulate around these attempts?
Unfortunately, conspiracy theories have been around as long as there's been more than two people. And certainly American history was rife with conspiracy theories. In fact, you can make a pretty good argument that the American Revolution essentially begins in response to a perceived conspiracy by the Crown and Parliament to destroy American liberties. The evidence is less impressive than the fact that people responded to the evidence and banded together, and then one thing leads to another. Obviously, you cannot discuss JFK's assassination without the word conspiracy coming up very soon thereafter. And in fact, if I could drill down on that for a second,
Yeah.
One of the really interesting sort of methodological lessons that one takes as a historian from really looking at something like the JFK assassination is that when you talk to conspiracy theorists, they will point out all these amazing connections that occur. And I'm going to make one up. This is made up. This is made up. That John Wilkes Booth went to kindergarten with a cop who was on the street with a street daughter, who then also dated a guy who was in the Marines in the same unit as so-and-so. I think I just said John Wilkes Booth. I meant Lee Harvey Oswald. You get my point.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is that I would contend that The reason that we know about all those coincidences is that they're actually happening every single day, but we don't take the time to investigate them with a fine-tooth comb, a powerful telescope, if you will, like we did on the day that Kennedy was shot. So for example, if you take a plane ride, I bet you we can come up with 100 connections between you and other people on the plane if we work hard enough and if we spend enough time on it. But we don't do that for every day. So therefore, when people come up with connections and conspiracies, I think in large part it's because A, we want the world to make sense. We want the chaotic world to have somebody actually in charge. And B, frankly, the world is chaotic. And if we actually looked at it close enough every single day, we would find that it's basically equally chaotic across every day.
So it makes sense. Basically, it's like you can come up with any conspiracy theory at any time if you look hard enough. And then it creates a lot of chaos around these events, which is both counterproductive to a certain point. I guess it helps because there's more scrutiny, but when these theories come up and they're totally unfounded, it just misleads a lot of the American people. So let's talk about presidential security. How has it changed over time? So you said that there's been 12 or so attempts over 200 years. Have these attempts become easier or harder over time?
Well, I think these attempts have become much, much, much harder. Although I have to say, I've again, from the reporting that's just come out, I've been impressed by the skill that even this young amateur shooter was able to demonstrate in plotting the spot for him to shoot his rifle from. Obviously presidents didn't used to have security. And also, by the way, before John Kennedy, presidents would ride around in convertibles all the time. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was shot at when he was president-elect and continued to ride in a convertible after that. So the security has just increased a thousandfold, a millionfold over what it used to be. So it's really a statement, I think, about American society, mostly post Kennedy's assassination, that we assume every day that somebody would like to kill the president. And the Secret Service starts from the presumption that the world is a dangerous place and that the president not only requires that kind of protection, but is in need of that kind of protection. And I have to say, the Secret Service people whom I've interacted with, I don't know anybody who doesn't say this, are extraordinary individuals and have an extraordinarily difficult job, if for no other reason than we never hear about their successes. The Secret Service director obviously just resigned over this last incident. She doesn't get any credit, and again, I'm making up the number, for the 142 cases that they prevented, for the times when they got to a would-be assassin or identified a threat before it was a problem, because you never hear about those. You only hear about the times where it goes bad, and it just takes once, obviously, to make a person lose their job and obviously make a person, unfortunately, lose their life.
Yeah, I mean, let's focus on that because I do think that the Secret Service doesn't get enough credit. These people have to defend the president 24/7, 365 under an incredible number and intensity of threats. I mean, how difficult is that job that every time the president moves, you got to watch their back 24/7, 365?
Well, and it's worse than that because the president also happens to be a politician. So, if you're, if you're charged with protecting a famous movie star, that movie star could decide to go to an isolated beach and hang out there all the time. Presidents, especially on campaign, want to get into the crowd and want to press the flesh. And that just, they are by nature going to put themselves in dangerous situations and by nature of their job have to be out in front of other people. So the Secret Service, I do not envy that job one bit, and I can only imagine the anxiety that they have. I've actually spent a lot of time with former presidents, and their Secret Service details are extraordinarily rigid, impressive, comprehensive. If I could tell actually one funny story
Of course,
about that.
please.
I did some work with President H.W. Bush 41. And we spent some time together, and he and I were riding in his armored limo, little SUV, from lunch to his office. And as I often did, because I'm a normal person, when we stopped, I opened the car door and got out. And the Secret Service agent chief came up to me later and said, Jeff, you're just not getting it. You need to let us open the door because we don't want the assassin's bullet to ricochet off you and hit the president. Now,
You're like, thanks.
Right. There's a couple of lessons there. The first is, okay, this is not a normal situation. I have to let somebody else open the door for me. They have to check things out. By the same token, it was very clear that they were very clear that if anything ever happens, we're leaving you behind. Like,
For sure.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. They're like, if the bullet hits you, that's fine. Just don't let it ricochet.
Right.
Just absorb the bullet. Don't let it ricochet, please, Jeff.
Somebody will be by to pick you up.
Exactly. I'm sure we'll call 911 about half an hour later.
Exactly.
Let's talk about how these attempts affect the candidate, right? So in this situation, Trump, overall in history, if you look back, how do these attempts affect candidates when they're running for presidency? Typically, does it weaken or does it strengthen their overall candidacy?
I'm going to tell you, and I don't mean to kill this conversation in a sense, but we don't have enough data. We don't have enough data of what it looks like for a modern presidential campaign. Unfortunately, we know what happened with Bobby Kennedy, for example. That's a really modern campaign. We know what happened with George Wallace, but he wasn't going to win the presidency anyway when he was shot, and he was just a candidate. So we don't really know. And I think it was very interesting to see people react to Donald Trump's reactions and also Donald Trump's subsequent convention speech, that it was essentially a Rorschach test for how they all thought the world worked. That is to say, some people thought and reacted and said, well, Donald Trump will clearly develop more religious faith now because clearly God saved him. And Trump alluded to that. Others would suggest that this will make him a nicer person, a greater unifier. And he suggested that in the first half of his campaign speech, and then, of course, forgot about it in the second half of his campaign speech and hasn't remembered it since. So, I think there are some instances for some individuals, and here I'm out of my league just as a pop psychologist, where this kind of event can change your life. And then for others, it has no effect whatsoever. And it appears, at least in the first instance, that President Trump doesn't seem to have been too affected. I do want to mention two other presidential historical stories, if you will. The first is that Andrew Jackson, and if you remember from your history books, Andrew Jackson was a very belligerent person. Let's put it that way. Nicest way you could possibly put it. After he was shot at, he wound up beating the would-be assassin with his own cane. So, Andrew Jackson was a badass.
That's awesome. What a great story. Way to handle your business.
But secondly, Theodore Roosevelt, and this was a little similar to Trump in a sense. Theodore Roosevelt, it was in Wisconsin actually, was on his way to give a speech in 1912 when he was running as a third party candidate for the Bull Moose Party. And he leaves his hotel and he gets shot in the chest. And the bullet entered his chest, but it was slowed down enough, if you will, by the fact that he had a very large text, like 60 pages of his speech and his eyeglasses in his jacket pocket right where the bullet hit, which meant he was bleeding. And I'm showing you this because he actually went on stage and insisted upon giving his speech and opened his jacket and said, I have been shot. Here is the blood. And that's how much they want to stop me. That's how much they're going to try to stop all of us. And I contend that had he walked off the stage at that point and gone to the hospital like his advisors wanted, it would have gone down as the greatest speech in American history. Instead, he wound up speaking for another 90 minutes. So, sort of every moment that ticks off after the man says, I've been shot, you kind of lose a little bit of the awe factor.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. So we've gone over the candidates, but what about the country? Looking back at history, when there is an assassination attempt on the president or a candidate, does it typically divide the country or does it unite us?
Again, sorry to be difficult, but the answer is both. It unites more people than it divides, typically. That's say more people come together and say, wow, I don't want that to happen again. And we need to look inside ourselves and see what are we doing. And politicians generally, at least have a short period of coalescing together. Then they revert back to their normal habits. The unfortunate thing is that there's a smaller group of people whom any act of violence, attempted act of violence, radicalizes. So we are much more likely, statistically speaking, to see some kind of copycat attack in the next couple of years because of this event than we were before. Because now, if you think about it, and this is not a critique against anyone, because the world is complex and everybody has a hard job, but we all know the name of this person. This person is going to go down in history. They are going to be remembered. And that was their goal. So if you are another individual who is angry and wants to be remembered, you might see this as your avenue. I'm not recommending that as a policy. I'm just saying that there are individuals who seem to take that lesson.
Yeah. I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but out of all the assassination attempts, successful or not, on this country, which one had the greatest impact?
I'm going to go with Abraham Lincoln.
Over JFK.
Over JFK.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is that JFK, I think, and I hate to cast aspersion on a man who died in office, but JFK is remembered as a much more popular president than he was. The reason he was in Texas in the first place was that he needed to try to shore up support within Texas to make sure that he could win re-election. And it wasn't clear that he was going to get that support or win re-election, frankly. And JFK was so young that I think that he presents to us psychologically the ever opportunity of promise, that anything that you want to think might have happened, you can say, well, if only Kennedy had lived, especially since we know the 60s became so tumultuous afterwards, and Vietnam. In fact, I've had many an argument with my own mother about the fact that she is absolutely convinced that John Kennedy would never have let Vietnam become Vietnam. I tell her there's zero historical evidence for that. In fact, it's actually quite the contrary.
Yeah.
But she's not interested in the historical evidence. She wants her hero, if you will. But go back to Lincoln. What's amazing about the Lincoln story is we know that the horrible Civil War was perhaps the greatest crisis any president has ever faced, greatest crisis our nation has ever faced. And we know that the aftermath, Reconstruction, was messy and uncomfortable and ugly, and is still being felt today, I would argue, with its ramifications, especially in areas like voting and civil rights. And Lincoln, in a sense, from a Shakespearean sense, does the best thing possible, which is always leave us wondering what would have happened with the rest of his presidency. He had just been reelected. We remember he had just had his second inauguration, essentially. So it is entirely possible that we could look at Lincoln, had he not been killed, and say, boy, great wartime president, man, did he screw up Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you could say, boy, if only Lincoln had been there for Reconstruction, it would have gone better. I actually don't think that's the case, but that is because race relations and questions of that circle around the Civil War and its aftermath continue to have ramifications in our society. I think there's no way that you can look past Lincoln as the most important and most dramatic, if you will, of the impacts of an assassination.
Now, what about the rest of the world? You know, we obviously see what happens here in the U.S., and you went over the numbers. How do we compare to other industrialized countries that have leaders? Do they have more or less on average assassination attempts?
We have more, frankly, because we have more guns. This is not possible, really, in many countries. In fact, just anecdotally, I happened to be on Australian National Public Radio the day after Trump was shot at. And the first question from the announcer was, how is this possible? Because, in our country, we've outlawed guns. Why don't you outlaw guns? And I said to her, that's a tough question in America. I said, I can tell you my personal views on it, but that's a tough question in America. That's not going to happen. So, I think one of the lessons that we need to take from the entire experience of escalating violence in our country, first of all, is the lesson that violence is actually going down in our country and crime is going down in our country. It just so happens that mass shootings and mass killings are themselves happening again and again. This doesn't really raise or affect the number of people who die over the course of a year in the United States, but it does make the news. And it makes the news oftentimes because we have very, very disgruntled, angry people. But every society has disgruntled, angry people, but only in America and a few other places do they have access to semi-automatic weapons.
Yeah, gun control is enough material for 5 podcasts, so we'll stay off of that because I feel like you and I are on the same wavelength. From what we know, could this attempt on Trump have been avoided? Do you think that there was an error made, or this is just, look, no one's 100% secure, and that this was just one of those things that happened?
Two things. Whenever there's a victim of crime, and let's think of this as a crime, whenever there's a victim of crime, the person always says, I could have done things differently. I could have gone right instead of left. Maybe I should have actually fixed that light bulb. Maybe I should have actually locked that door, etc. And it's important to remember that a person who is interested enough in committing a violent act that they're willing to sacrifice their own life, which is the outcome in one of these situations, they're always going to have the advantage. They're always going to be able to get through at some level if they really, really want to. From the initial reporting, it seems as though some of the Secret Service procedures didn't quite work out, and there was probably a miscommunication with whether or not local officials or Secret Service were in charge of one area or another. Again, I think if we looked at every single presidential event with a microscope, ones that you've never heard about because nothing interesting happened, we could still say in an after action report, there wasn't great communication between these two. And you know what? That building actually wasn't covered the way it was supposed to be. And over here, somebody should have winnowed out that tree and didn't. And so all these perfectly normal things are going to show up as mistakes because they are mistakes in the procedures not being followed correctly, but no one is 100% at everything.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I think, like you said, that the Secret Service doesn't get credit for their 99.99999% success rate. You just get penalized when something like this happens, and it's never going to be 100%. So I totally agree with you. Getting into your personal ideas about this event, how do you see this event impacting our country as a whole with the election coming up? Is this going to unite us, divide us?
I think it's going to be forgotten. And to be honest, I think it's going to be a footnote within a footnote to history. Most people don't know Theodore Roosevelt was shot. Most people don't know that William McKinley was shot, and that was a successful attack. And most people don't know Harry Truman. Did you know Harry Truman was shot at?
No idea.
As president. It's actually a really interesting story, but that's not the point. The point is, I think this is going to be forgotten because it didn't have the assassin's intended effect. And I don't even know if assassin is really the right word, because that implies that there is a motive, a political motive. I think just deranged shooter might be the better
maniac.
Yeah,
maniac.
So it is interesting that the Republicans, because it was their candidate, and I'm sure the Democrats would have done the exact same thing, Republicans immediately started using the word they, as in they shot at my president. We saw J.D. Vance tweet that immediately afterwards. We saw Hulk Hogan. I love talking about Hulk Hogan. In presidential history, say that at the convention, they shot at my president. And that's not actually what happened. But because this was a political figure, we just would like there to be a political motive to it. Otherwise, it's just random chaos. And I think that will encourage some people to come together. But to be honest, in our own political environment, I'm not sure that there's anything that could really bring us together.
How do you feel this is going to impact Trump's candidacy?
Not at all. I think Trump got a boost of sympathy. If this were to have happened 2 days before the vote, I would say we need to think about that question. But we're 100-something days away, and there's going to be 40 more things, hopefully not as dramatic, but 40 more things where we're going to look at each other and say, how's that going to affect the outcome? And then they're going to be forgotten when the next 40 show up. So I, as a general rule, don't really worry about uh, unexpected events and hiccups until about 3 weeks before the election. And here's the interesting thing: uh, I guarantee you, we could bet $100 right now. I guarantee you that something completely out of left field is going to upend and change our dynamics of the election 3 weeks beforehand. But I have no idea what it is, and nobody does.
Wow, kind of exciting. I guess we'll have to wait with bated breath. Final question, because I know you're so busy. Looking ahead, our politics have become so radicalized and so polarized, and the parties continue to divide further and further. Do you think that the attempts are going to become more and more frequent over time?
I'll be completely, utterly honest with you. I'm actually very surprised we haven't seen more. I have been surprised for some time in our current political environment that someone hasn't tried to take matters into their own hands. And if you look at the rhetoric from, I hate to term both sides, all sides, but let's just take, leading Democrats and leading Republicans. Each of them have members of their party, sometimes the leadership of their party, who cast the other party as evil and the other party leaders as demons. Um, you know, Donald Trump is going to destroy democracy, or Joe Biden is going to destroy your country by letting immigrants in. Uh, Either of those and that level of rhetoric encourages someone to think that, I could be the hero here. I could not just go down in history, but an actual politically motivated person could say, I mean, if Donald Trump or President Bob Harrison was going to do something that's going to destroy America and I stop them, doesn't that make me a hero? I mean, we celebrate the people who sacrificed their lives for our
Hmm.
country's wars. We celebrate first responders. The logic is not any different for a person who, if they genuinely believe that their life would save American democracy, I'm not sure I wouldn't want to. I might have that conversation too. So I am surprised we haven't had so much, and I hope to God we don't have any more.
I totally agree. Listen, Jeff, thank you so much for your time. I can only say that we are in crazy political times. I think everyone would agree, whether you are Republican or Democrat. It's just crazy times compared to what it used to be. Like you said, the violent rhetoric that never used to exist. And it used to be that, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican who won, the views were somewhat similar, but it's so polarized now that these elections are becoming so much more important than they used to be. And so I think it's important for all Americans to really know the facts, know the history like you're talking about before they make such an important decision, because ultimately these elections and this one will really have a dramatic effect on where this country heads.
That's an extraordinarily important point, and I hope that people really take it to heart because we spend a lot of our time, just the way our society is set up, talking about here's what I think about Biden, here's what I think about Trump, here's what I think about Harris, and so on down the line. I'm hard pressed to think of an election, maybe the 1860 election, but I don't like to bring that up. Hard pressed to think of an election where there is such a clear policy distinction between the two candidates' parties, between what America will look like if one wins versus another. And I hope that we can remind ourselves as citizens, yeah, we're voting for the name at the top of the ticket, but that person really is bringing 9,000 people to Washington with them, and they're the ones who are going to affect our lives. And that's the choice that Americans have.
It's a very dramatic election coming up, and it's always great chatting with you, Jeff. And I really appreciate all your expertise, opinion on this matter, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Thanks so much
I,
for your
I
time.
look forward to it too. Thanks a bunch.
All right, buddy.